Hello, wonderful people. Nice to see you again. Today we're going to be looking at, a quite interesting topic today. But before I go into that particular topic, I just want to actually highlight one or two things about the 2023 waec specimen A and B questions. Now, those questions, and if you have actually seen the specimen, I think specimen A is a mature fresh egg of a catfish, and then also specimen B is a fresh egg of domestic fowl. And if you look at those two particular specimens, in fact, we're going to be discussing some of those things in this particular topic. We're going to be looking at some of them. And I would also want you to pay rapt attention to this particular video, as it's going to actually give you a leverage or a help in answering some of the questions that might pop up concerning mostly specimen A and specimen B. Now, I can just actually chip in one or two questions on specimen A and B. Now, for instance, I want you to quickly take note of the habitat of specimen A and B, where you can find them. It's quite very important. Another thing, again, you should take note of is the method of reproduction and the type of fertilization that occurs both in specimen A as well as in specimen B. Another thing, again, is that, of course, you should be able to identify them and mostly mention some similarities between specimen A and B. And we're going to be looking at some of the similarities, probably 2 or 3 similarities between specimen A and specimen B. And then also you should be able to tell some adaptive features of specimen A and B to their environment. There are several things that actually helps them adapt to their environment. For instance, we have the shell, or the shell that is actually made up of calcium, where we have the domestic fowl, that's specimen B. Now, I think that shell helps it adapt to its environment. It helps to regulate the movement of water in and out of the shell, and also protects the shell from harm. Of course, it's a terrestrial place. It can get several external factors affecting it. The shell gives that protection, and so many other things we are going to be looking at concerning the shell, or concerning both specimen A and B. All right. Now, if you're ready for this particular topic, the topic is actually reproduction in vertebrates. Reproduction in vertebrates. We're going to be exploring a whole lot of things. One of the first things we're going to be looking at as a subtopic is that we're going to be talking about the meaning, and we're also going to be looking at the purpose of reproduction. Meaning and purpose of reproduction. Number 2 subtopic we're going to cover in this particular topic is the types of reproduction, which has to do with the sexual and asexual reproduction. We're just going to briefly run through it as a summary because we've talked about it quite before. We're also going to be looking at important terms. These are the areas I would want you to actually pay more attention to. We're going to be talking about some important terms in reproduction in vertebrates. And then also we're going to be looking at reproduction in Pisces and amphibians. When we're talking about Pisces, we're actually looking at fishes. And then we're also going to be talking about reproduction in amphibians. We're also going to be looking at reproduction in aves, which are birds, and then also reproduction in reptiles. We're also going to be talking about the structure of an amniote egg. We're also going to be looking at reproduction in mammals, and then we're also going to compare sexual reproduction among these vertebrates. We're going to compare them among these vertebrates. Now, please, if you're ready for us to begin this class, I would want you to take note of the specific objective. Now, the specific objective is actually things you should be able to answer, questions you should be able to answer at the end of this particular topic. Now, your being able to answer this question is a sign or indication that you have actually understood the topic. You know everything you need to know about this topic. And of course, these are the major areas you should concentrate on in this particular topic. The first one is by the end of this class, you should be able to define and mention the types of reproduction. You should also be able to mention the types of sexual and asexual reproduction. Now, each of these types of reproduction also have different types. And then number 3, you should be able to mention some terms or define some terms. And we're going to be looking at those terms and see how you can define them. And then briefly, number 4, you should be able to explain briefly sexual reproduction in fishes as well as in amphibians. And then also you should be able to explain briefly sexual reproduction in aves as well as in reptiles. And then finally, you should be able to compare, because this comparison helps to give you an idea of the similarities as well as the differences among these vertebrates. Now, if you are actually set for this particular class, let's begin with the definition of reproduction. Now, what is reproduction? Reproduction can simply be defined as the process by which living organisms give rise to new individuals or young ones after their kind, or you can say of the same species. I said it is the process by which living organisms give rise to new individuals after their kind or of the same species. So that is what we call reproduction. Now, what is actually the purpose for reproduction? What is the purpose? Now, reproduction has several purposes. One of the purposes for reproduction is to actually ensure the continuous existence of life from one generation to another. Now, imagine if your forefathers didn't give birth to the next predecessor or the next generation. It means that there will be no continuity of life. There will be no continuous existence. Okay? There will be no continuous existence of that particular lineage, of that particular generation. So one of the major purposes for reproduction is to ensure the continuous existence of life from one generation to another. Number 2 purpose for reproduction is to maintain the population of young, adult, and aged individuals of a species. To maintain the population of young, adult, and aged individuals of a species. And then number 3 also is to replace individuals dying due to aging. Of course, when life has a limit or a point where life ceases to exist, okay, we have several levels of development. We have development into the infant stage, childbirth. We have infant stage, which is also the childhood stage. And then from infancy, we go to childhood stage, from the childhood stage to the adolescent, from the adolescent to the adult, from the adult to the aged, from the aged, and you get the person dies. But for us to be able to replace individuals that are dying due to aging, one of the ways we can do that is through what? Reproduction. And number 4 purpose for reproduction is to introduce variation. Introduce variation. Now, what is variation? Variation can simply be seen as those physical and physiological and morphological changes or differences which occurs within a given species, which occurs within a given, or which occurs within members of a given species. An example is in terms of height. In terms of height. Now, if you look at humans, we are all not all of the same height. We have different heights. If you come to a particular class, you have different heights. In a particular family where they are closely related, we have different heights of individuals there. They are of the same species, but they have different heights. You have also individuals of different sizes. You have individuals of different color. Now, these are what we call variations. So one of the purpose for reproduction is to introduce variations in organisms. Now, useful variations help in adaptation as well as in evolution. Now, number 5 is the last, which the purpose of for reproduction is to ensure the existence of life on earth, which is only possible due to reproduction. So these are some of the purpose for reproduction. Now, apart from this, there are different types of reproduction we have. Types of reproduction. Now, basically, we have two types of reproduction. One of them is called sexual reproduction, and the second one is called asexual reproduction. Now, for the sake of what we have today, we are actually going to be exploring all these briefly, all these types of reproduction. We're going to be briefly looking at sexual reproduction. We're also going to be briefly looking at asexual reproduction. Let's begin with the first one, which is sexual reproduction. Now, what exactly is sexual reproduction? Sexual reproduction can simply be defined as a type of reproduction that involves the fusion of gametes. Please note, it involves the fusion of gametes. It involves the fusion of gametes, or I can say it involves the fusion of male and female gametes. Now, based on this definition, you will agree with me that sexual reproduction involves two parent organisms, a male and a female, and they produce gametes. It is not just only the fusion of gametes. Sexual reproduction has to do with the production and the fusion of gametes. So there must be a male gamete and there must be a presence of a female gamete. So one important fact about sexual reproduction is that two parent organisms are actually involved. And then the second important fact about sexual reproduction is that the fusion of these gametes form what we call a zygote. This zygote actually develops into what we call an embryo, and the embryo develops into what we call a fetus, and the fetus is now delivered as a child, or sorry, is delivered as a young one or a new individual. So from the fetus we get the new individual. All right. Another thing again you should take note about sexual reproduction is that it involves the process of meiosis. It involves the process of meiosis, not mitosis, meiosis, okay? So, and another important thing again to take note of in sexual reproduction is that sexual reproduction brings about a diploid organism. The organisms are usually haploid, not diploid, haploid. They produce haploid cells or haploid gametes which fuse together to form a diploid gamete or a diploid organism. Okay. Now, another important thing to take note about sexual reproduction is the types of sexual reproduction. We have primarily two types of sexual reproduction. We have the first one, which is called conjugation. Conjugation. Now, conjugation is actually a type of sexual reproduction in which nuclear materials, that is materials that are found in the nucleus, is passed from one cell into another cell. Now, the one that passes from one cell that passes into another cell is usually referred to as the male, and the one that receives nuclear materials is usually referred to as the female. Okay, so in terms of conjugation, we have several organisms that carry out conjugation. Now, mostly you see them in lower multicellular organisms. Okay, an example of organisms that carry out conjugation, we have Spirogyra, we have unicellular organisms like Paramecium, we have Mucor, we have Rhizopus, and so many others. These are actually organisms that carry out conjugation as a type of sexual reproduction. Now, the next type of sexual reproduction is called fertilization. Fertilization. Now, fertilization is actually a type of sexual reproduction which involves the production and the union of gametes. The production and the union of gametes, and they give rise to what we call a zygote. They give rise to what we call a zygote. Now, examples of organisms that actually undergo fertilization as a type of sexual reproduction are, we have higher plants And then we also have higher animal. Higher plants and higher animals, they undergo fertilization. Next is asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction in which new individuals are formed or produced from a single parent without the production and the union of gametes. Now, if you look at the definition for asexual reproduction, you will understand and pick out some important facts. One of them is that there is no production of gametes. Number two, there is no union of gametes in asexual reproduction. Number three is that the gametes or only a single parent or one parent is involved in this type of reproduction. Just one parent is involved in this type of reproduction. And the offspring that is produced in asexual reproduction is usually called a clone. It is called a clone, okay? You've heard of the word a clone. It looks exactly almost like the parent organism. They look exactly or almost like the parent organism. So that's a clone. Now we have different types of asexual reproduction. We have what we call binary fission. That is one of the important first type of asexual reproduction, binary fission. Now, binary fission is a type of asexual reproduction in which one parent cell divides into two equal parts. And these two equal parts or cells are what we call daughter cells. They divide into two equal parts or two equal cells, which are called daughter cells. Now, this type of reproduction is mostly carried out or mostly found operated by unicellular organisms. Examples of some of these organisms that carry out binary fission, we have mostly the protists, and then we have the monerans. Like an example for monera is bacteria. Bacteria is a monera, and it carries out binary fission. That's to split. Fusion means to join together. And then also in terms of protozoa, we have euglena, we have amoeba, we have paramecium, we have so many others, plasmodium, etc. They all undergo the process of binary fission. Okay. Number two is budding. Budding is also another type of asexual reproduction. Budding. Now, budding is a type of asexual reproduction in which one parent organism forms an outgrowth. Now, this outgrowth is what we call a bud. This outgrowth, once it grows to a particular length or it grows to a particular size, it now detaches from the parent organism, falls to the ground, and then starts up its own life. So we call that budding. So it's another type of asexual reproduction. And now the new organism later separates, okay, an example of organisms you find carrying out this type of reproduction, we have yeast. Yeast also carries out budding. We also have hydra. Hydra and yeast, they are perfect examples of organisms that undergo budding as a type of asexual reproduction. We also have number three type of asexual reproduction called spore formation. Spore formation. Now, spore formation is actually a type of asexual reproduction in which an organism produces numerous spores. And these spores are carried in what we call the sporangium. Okay. Now, once this particular plant is mature, the sporangium ruptures and releases these spores, which are dispersed. And when they fall on a suitable substrate, these spores germinate into a new organisms. They germinate into new organisms. Now, an example of an organism that carries out spore formation is a fungi, and that fungi is rhizopus. So rhizopus carries out the process of spore formation. And then lastly is vegetative reproduction. Now we have other types of asexual reproduction. We also have what we call fragmentation, which is also carried out by Spirogyra. Now, please also take note that some organisms carry out both asexual reproduction as well as sexual reproduction. Some carry out both sexual and asexual. An example is paramecium that carries out both sexual and asexual. Another example is Spirogyra that carries out both fragmentation, which is an asexual reproduction, and also carries out conjugation, which is also an asexual reproduction. Now, quickly, number 4, or the 4th type of asexual reproduction, is what we call vegetative reproduction. Vegetative reproduction. Now, vegetative reproduction is a type of asexual reproduction in which new individuals are produced from vegetative parts of the plant. Vegetative parts of the plant. Now, these vegetative parts of the plants are things like the stem, we have the roots, we have the leaves. There are some new organisms that can be gotten out from just planting the stem. For instance, we have the cassava stem, which when planted germinates into a new what? Plant. Okay, so these are what we call vegetative reproduction. Now, we have different types of vegetative reproduction. We have asexual reproduction, which is carried out asexual reproduction is a type of asexual reproduction that is actually carried out by plants as well as lower animals. Okay, mostly in terms of plant. Mostly in terms of plants, you see vegetative reproduction. Now, we have different types of vegetative reproduction. We have the natural vegetative reproduction, and when we also have the artificial vegetative reproduction. Now, natural vegetative reproduction involves the use of fleshy leaves, where leaves are propagated and also modified underground stem. Now, if you go back to the WAEC 2023 past question, if you look at the practical questions manual, you will see, I think, one of the specimen, I can't actually picture or remember the particular specimen, I think that should be either K or L, we have cocoyam. Cocoyam is a modified underground stem. Okay, so it undergoes natural vegetative reproduction, which is also a type of asexual reproduction. Please take note of this. And that is the corm. Okay, we have several examples of natural vegetative reproduction. Okay, for that, this thing we have the stem. Okay, the stem of some plants. We have also what we call artificial vegetative reproduction. We have artificial vegetative reproduction, which is also found in plants. Plants carry out artificial vegetative reproduction. Now, we have examples of artificial vegetative reproduction, which includes things like marcotting. We also have things like grafting. We also have things like layering. These are different types of artificial vegetative reproduction. We call that vegetative propagation. We have marcotting, we have budding, we have stem cutting, and these are all examples of artificial vegetative reproduction. Now, we have come to the end of this sexual and asexual reproduction. We're not done, but what are some important differences between asexual and asexual reproduction? Now, if you were paying attention, I told you of some important facts on sexual as well as asexual reproduction. Now, let's look at some of them. Number 1, I told you that in terms of asexual reproduction, it involves only one parent. But in terms of sexual reproduction, it involves 2 parent organisms. Number 2 difference is that in asexual reproduction, it does not involve the production, neither does it involve the union of gametes or sex cells. But in terms of sexual reproduction, it involves the production, it involves the union of gametes. Number 3, I told you that in sexual reproduction, meiosis is involved. Okay, but in asexual reproduction, it is mitosis that is actually involved. Another difference between sexual and asexual reproduction is that in sexual reproduction, their offsprings vary genetically. But in terms of asexual reproductions, their offsprings are identical, and that's why we call them clones. Okay, you can also add this as number 5, that their offsprings are called clones, as in terms of asexual reproduction, but in terms of sexual reproduction, the offsprings are called zygotes. The offsprings are called zygotes. Now, quickly before we call it a timeout in this particular topic on reproduction in vertebrates, I want you to take note of this. Now, there are some important terms we need to look out for. One of them is called oviparity. Oviparity. Now, this is also going to help us understand what oviparity is and also help in the practicals as in terms of a mature fresh egg of a catfish. Now, what is oviparity? Oviparity is actually a process, or you can call it a method of reproduction carried out by animals, okay, through which they lay eggs. Thus, they give rise to their young ones by laying what? Eggs. They lay eggs. Now, the embryo in the egg later grows and then develops outside the body. Please get to understand the difference. The eggs grow and develops outside the body of the vertebrate, after which it hatches, mostly as it relates to animals that are actually terrestrial. It hatches into a new individual. Now, if I should compare a mature fresh egg or the egg of a catfish and the egg of a domestic fowl. Now, if we're to look at similarities between these two organisms or these two specimens, now I can say that both specimens are produced by the method of oviparity. That's a similarity. They are both produced by the method of what? Oviparity, a method of reproduction which is called oviparity. So they are both products of oviparity. Number two is that both organisms or both specimens, that is the egg of catfish and the egg of the domestic fowl, the embryo actually grows and develops into a new individual outside the body. It is outside the body of their female of the parent organism, outside the body of the parent organism. Please take note of this. These are two important similarities between the egg of a catfish, which stays in water, and the egg of a domestic fowl or a terrestrial organism, okay, like we can call an example domestic fowl. Like the first one I said is that they both undergo, they are both produced by oviparity. Number two is that the eggs, actually the embryo develops and grows outside the body of their parent organism, okay? And then also number three, we can say that both embryo develop into a new individual. They both develop into a new individual. All right. Now, another thing again to take note of in terms of oviparity is that there are some organisms that undergo oviparity. Please take note, all vertebrates except mammals undergo oviparity. All vertebrates. Now, by all vertebrates, I mean Pisces, I mean amphibians, aves, reptiles. They all undergo oviparity, okay? The next important term to note is viviparity. Viviparity. Now, viviparity is actually something quite the opposite of oviparity. Now, in viviparity, living organisms are giving birth to, alive. Now, we can say in terms of oviparity, these organisms is a type of reproduction in which new individuals are given rise to by laying of eggs. But in this case, they are given rise to by giving birth to them alive. They give birth to young ones alive. Now, you find this happening mostly in mammals, not in other vertebrates. It occurs only in mammals. Now, also in viviparity, that's a major difference between oviparity and viviparity. I've given you two differences. In oviparity, eggs are being laid. In viviparity, eggs are not laid. In oviparity, we can also call this one the third one, that the young ones are not giving birth to alive, but in terms of viviparity, the young ones are giving birth to alive, or new individuals are giving birth to alive. And then also another difference in oviparity and between oviparity and viviparity is that during viviparity, the young one, or the embryo, or the zygote that is being that is the product of the fusion of these gametes, grow and develop outside. It grows and develops outside the body of the parent organism. But in terms of viviparity, it develops and grows inside of the body of the female parent organism. It develops inside of the body of the female parent organism. Please take note of the differences between the two of them, all right? Now, another one we're going to be looking at is, another important term is external fertilization. Also, in sexual reproduction, we have two types of fertilization. We have what we call external fertilization and internal fertilization. Now, external fertilization is a type of fertilization in which the eggs from the female is fertilized outside the body of the female. Outside the body of the female organism, or parent organism, outside. Now, an example of organisms that carry out external fertilization, it includes all Pisces, it includes all amphibians, and also, all Pisces and amphibians undergo external fertilization. All Pisces and amphibians undergo external fertilization. And then we also have the next one, which is called internal fertilization. Now, internal fertilization is a type of fertilization in which the egg is fertilized inside the body of the female. You can see the difference, inside the body of the female. Now, in terms of specimen C, which is the picture of the uterus containing the egg, also containing the fetus, you will understand that it undergoes internal fertilization. Also, specimen B in the upcoming waec practicals, you will also understand that the type of fertilization for specimen B is also internal fertilization, because the eggs are fertilized internally, okay, inside the body of the female animal. And then in terms of specimen A, the type of fertilization is actually external fertilization, The next thing to look at is what? Unisexuality. Unisexuality. Now, what is actually unisexuality? It is, these are organisms, okay? An organism is actually said to be unisexual if it possesses a single sex organ, or if it possesses a single reproductive organ, okay, or system. Now, organisms that have a single reproductive system or organ can either be a male or what? A female. So when we say a unisexual animal, would mean that these animals can either be a male, they have males, they have females. That's what we call unisexuality. Now, not all organisms are unisexual. Not all animals are unisexual. Well, to an extent, all vertebrates can be referred to as unisexual. Pisces, we have a male, we have a female, and then in terms of amphibians, we have both male and female. The same goes for the birds, male and female. The same goes for reptiles, we have male and female, and then the same goes for mammals. We also have male and female. Okay, I believe some of you might be sort of like coming up with an idea, saying that there are some, what will I call them, she-males, or humans that have both reproductive organs. Well, I don't know, we can actually classify them as probably bisexual, okay, because they possess both reproductive organs. And that brings us to the next important term, which is called bisexuality. Bisexuality. It has also been said that there are some organisms that possesses both male and female sex organs, both male and female sex organs. These organisms can also be called hermaphrodites. They can be called hermaphrodites. Now, we have several examples. We have, most examples are worms, okay? We have worms, and then we have mollusk. Worms and mollusk, they fall under these categories. They are actually bisexual. Now, quickly, before I turn off or call it a quit or a day in this particular video, I would like to give a brief a brief explanation on sexual reproduction in fish and then in amphibians. Now, in terms of fish and amphibians, they show what we call external fertilization, and they are all unisexual. They are unisexual, and they undergo external fertilization. Now, how does it happen in terms of a fish? Though we're going to be looking at it in subsequent videos. Now, for a fish to actually carry out sexual reproduction, a male fish pairs with a female fish, and they go to a place that is actually quiet in the waters, where it is not deep, but a bit shallow, and it is not fast flowing or running. And then the female releases her eggs. A mature female releases her eggs there, and the male simultaneously releases a sperm cell to fertilize it externally, And that is how sexual reproduction is carried out in fishes or in Pisces. Also in amphibians, sexual reproduction is carried out through several ways. You can have pairing and also display. In terms of this, I mean that in terms of the amphibians, they are unisexual, like I've said before. So a male amphibian, for instance, a frog, starts croaking. When you hear the croaking sound, that's a form of display, a courtship behavior. And it sends these croaking signals, and which attracts females that are ready or mature for reproduction or sexual reproduction. The female comes to the male, and the male hops the back of the female, and the female carries the male for up to 2 or 3 days. Now, the reason, the female is actually larger in terms of size because of the eggs she carries within. So the male is being carried on the back of the female 2 to 3 days, and they go to a place where you have a shallow water, and that the water is actually not fast flowing, probably stagnant, and the female releases her eggs while the male releases his sperm cells to fertilize it externally. And that is also how sexual reproduction occurs in amphibians. But please take note that the mating environment for both fishes and amphibians is usually aquatic. Amphibians don't lay their eggs on land. They lay their eggs in water. Okay, they lay their eggs in water. And one important thing probably that is actually not good about these two vertebrates is that after laying their eggs, after fertilization of their eggs, the eggs don't enjoy parental care. They don't enjoy parental care. And that's why most eggs of fishes and most eggs of amphibians are lost or killed by other or eaten by other animals. And we can call that kind of process, or their sexual reproduction, we can call it a wasteful process. Can be referred to as a wasteful process because there is no parental care, no or zero parental care. The next one is that is reproduction in reptiles and in birds. Now, fertilization of eggs in reptiles and in birds are done internally. When we say internally, it means that the male releases a sperm cell into the body of the female, and the eggs are still inside, and the eggs are fertilized right inside the body of the female. Now, after fertilization, reptiles and birds, they lay large eggs on dry land. Now, another major difference between the eggs of birds or reptiles and that of fishes and amphibians is that fishes and amphibians, they lay numerous eggs in thousands. Okay, they're in batches or in patch. But in terms of the eggs of reptiles and birds, they are actually few. Now, after fertilization, reptiles and birds, they lay large eggs on dry land. Now, these large eggs are referred to as amniote egg. Shortly, we'll be looking at what the amniote egg is all about. So they are called amniote egg. Now, these eggs laid on dry land develop and hatch into tiny or new individual animals or young animals, okay? So, however, reptiles show little or no parental care. They show little or no parental care, while the birds, they actually show parental care. Now let's take a look at the diagram of the amniote egg, the diagram of the amniote egg. Please take note that all eggs that are laid on land, they have shell intact, but the eggs that are laid in aquatic environments don't have shells intact. So there are no shells in the ones laid in aquatic environment, but there are shells in the ones laid or eggs laid in terrestrial habitat, okay, on dry land. Now, these shells are actually made up of calcium, okay? Now, if you look at a structure of the amniote egg, you will see that we have several parts of the amniote egg. It has a shell, it also has a shell membrane, it has an air space, it has a yolk, it has an embryo, it has what we call the albumen. I believe most of you have eaten boiled egg. When you finish boiling your egg and you open the shell from the egg, or you remove the shell from the egg, you will see this white part in the egg. That is what we call the albumen. And then when you open into it, you'll see a yellow stuff that is called the yolk. Now, inside of the yolk, we have the embryo, which is the young animal that is found inside, okay? Then we also have what we call the chalaza. Now, we're going to be looking at the parts of this amniote egg and their major functions. Now, first one is the embryo. Now, the embryo is actually the most important thing about the egg. That is the young individual inside. So it is the embryo that actually grows and develops into a new organism. I also told you that the amniote egg, which is the egg laid on dry land, they have what we call a shell. And this shell are made up of calcium. Now, what is the major function of the shell is that it protects the inner structure of the shell and also allows for gaseous exchange. The next thing you'll find after the shell is the shell membrane. There's this waterproof-like stuff or substance that actually covers the albumen, which is the white part. Now, that is what we call the shell membrane. The shell membrane provides moisture or provides moist gaseous exchange surface. If you look at our videos on respiration, you will understand there's what we call respiratory surface. And one of the functions of, or one of the importance of respiratory surface is that these characteristics of respiratory surface is that respiratory surfaces must be moist. It must be moist. So the shell membrane provides the moisture or provide moist for respiratory surfaces. And then also we have in the egg, we have airspace, and airspace is where gases are actually stored. And then we also have the albumen, which I told you is the white part. The albumen provides food such as protein and salt, and also water for the embryo. Then we also have the yolk part, cytoplasm. The yolk. Now, the yolk also provides food for the embryo, but the food it provides is mainly fats and proteins. Then we also have other parts that are found inside of the yolk. We have the amnion, we have the chorion. Now, the amnion provides or produces what we call the amniotic fluid. And the amniotic fluid acts as what we call a shock absorber and then hence protects the embryo. Also in humans, if you look at humans, the uterus also has the amnion for which the fetus can actually move around and also helps to prevent what? Shock. Okay, so shock absorber. Then also we have the chorion. Now the major function of the chorion is that it controls permeability and prevents water loss from the amnion. And then finally we have the chalaza. Now the chalaza holds the yolk and the embryo in position within the albumen. So these are some of the functions of the parts of the amniote egg. And then finally we also have reproduction in mammals. reproduction in mammals. Now we will discuss this in more details when we start looking at reproductive system in mammals. But please take note of this. Reproduction in mammals, mammals undergo viviparity, or you can say mammals are viviparous animals. Now it simply means they do not lay eggs, they rather give birth to young ones alive. Now fertilization in mammals, very important, is internal, and the environment for which the mammals carry out reproduction is usually terrestrial. Now, after reproduction, mammalian parents do not just leave their young ones to fend for themselves. They actually show parental care. They actually show parental care. Like I said before, in our subsequent videos, we're going to be discussing so much about reproduction in mammals. We're going to look at it in quite details and form. All right, so this is where we call it a wrap up in this particular class. But before I go, let's take just very few questions using the ExamGuide app. Just very few questions. I know there are a lot of questions coming out on reproduction, so I will also advise that you that is preparing for the upcoming 2023 waec, use the ExamGuide app. It will help you. You see so many questions on reproduction, and almost every year questions on reproduction always pop out. Now let's look at this first one. Which of the following is true of cloning? Which of the following is true of cloning? Number one says only one cell of the original organism is needed to initiate the process. Number two says it involves the asexual multiplication of tissues of organisms. Number three, C says it is welcomed as an ethical and moral sound science. And number four, or option D, says the clone is similar to but not exactly like the original organism. Well, for me, I could take the option A and D. Option A and D is correct, because only one cell of the original organism is actually needed to initiate the process. But if you look at option D also, the clone is quite very similar, but maybe not exactly like the original organism. So the correct answer we can pick is option D. Option D. Next is question 2. Which of the following processes is a form of sexual reproduction? Remember, we just talked about sexual reproduction. Is it budding? Is it binary fission? Is it rhizome production by ginger? And then is it conjugation in Spirogyra? Remember, I told you there are two types of sexual reproduction. We have conjugation and fertilization. So the correct answer is conjugation. And then question 3 says, which of the following processes is a form of sexual reproduction? Is still the same question, and that option is A. Now look at this, the type of asexual reproduction that is common to both paramecium and protist, and that correct answer is fission, which is binary fission. And then also we have, okay, let's take a look at this. They say the process illustrated here is sexual reproduction in rhizopus. This is sexual reproduction in rhizopus. And then, oh, good. Now, this question is hermaphroditic reproduction. So hermaphroditic reproduction can be found among. Now, remember I told you hermaphrodites can also be called bisexuality, where a particular organism has both male and female reproductive organs in one organism. Okay, you see that mostly in flowering plants, having both male and female reproductive organs. So the correct answer I gave the other time, in terms of animals, we have annelids and then mollusk. Thank you for participating in today's class. You can practice more questions using your ExamGuide app. The app scores and gives a detailed explanation of all the questions at the end of your practice test. You can also learn particular topics of interest with different modes, like study mode, mock mode, and even practice mode. It also has other features that makes learning very fun. Now, it is a must for all serious students. Download from www.examguide.com if you don't have it yet. See you in the next class. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, hit the notification bell and share the videos to your loved ones and friends that will benefit from it. Bye for now.